NAFTA. NAFTA was the worst trade deal in the history of our country. NAFTA was a very unfair deal for the United States. A very, very terrible deal. It should have never been made. It was made many years ago, but it should have never been made.
They called it a historic win for American manufacturing. But in the fine print of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, that is, the USMCA deal, a different story was being written, one of hidden taxes and a silent squeeze on Detroit. This is how a victory against Canada and Mexico started to backfire on the U.S. itself. Take a listen.
USMCA is the most advanced, modern, and balanced trade agreement ever negotiated. It is also the largest trade deal the United States has ever made, and we think it's the largest trade deal ever made in the world, $1.2 trillion in commerce a year.
If the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement was supposed to save American factories, why is Detroit still bleeding? Tonight, we're going to strip away the speeches, follow the rules buried in the fine print, and ask a simple question. Did USMCA really beat Canada and Mexico, or did it quietly turn into a hidden tax on America's own industrial base? Let's start with the world before Trump touched it. In 1994, NAFTA came into force. On paper, it was simple. The US, Canada, and Mexico would phase out most tariffs and build a single North American market. In reality, it turned the auto industry into a three-country assembly line. Parts for the same car could cross the border half a dozen times, engines cast in Ontario, wire harnesses built in Mexico, final assembly in Michigan, without hitting a tariff wall. American executives loved the efficiency. American workers in the Rust Belt saw something else: factories closing, production moving south, and politicians in both parties saying, "Globalization is inevitable." By the time Trump launched his 2016 campaign, NAFTA was no longer just a treaty. It was a symbol of offshoring, of corporate power, of a political class that looked the other way. Calling it the worst trade deal ever made was red meat. Promising to tear it up was applause guaranteed. Once in office, Trump had a problem. If he simply walked away from NAFTA, the chaos would hit his own base first. That is, farmers, manufacturers, and border state logistics. So the strategy became more subtle. Don't kill it, weaponize it. Use tariffs and threats like a crowbar to pry open a better deal. The first blow landed in 2018. Using national security as justification, Washington slapped 25% tariffs on imported steel and 10% on aluminum, hitting Canada and Mexico along with Europe and others. Suddenly, every North American factory, from car plants to construction, was paying more for basic metal. Ottawa and Mexico City got the message. If you want relief, come back to the table. Behind closed doors, U.S. negotiators added another loaded gun: threats of tariffs up to 25% on imported autos and parts. For Canada and Mexico, whose economies are deeply tied to U.S. car demand, that wasn't a bluff. It was an existential risk. So they came back. Talks dragged through 2017 and 2018. Trump floated withdrawal from NAFTA more than once. Negotiators worked in a constant shadow: sign something or live under permanent tariff blackmail. By late 2018, the three governments produced a new text: the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Trump got his rebrand. NAFTA was dead, at least in name. On the surface, not much had changed. Tariffs on most goods stayed at zero. The continent remained a single integrated market. But the real surgery happened in the auto chapter, deep in the technical annexes. That's where the cost of Trump's victory got wired into the system. Under NAFTA, a car needed about 62.5% of its value to come from North America to qualify for tariff-free treatment. USMCA cranked that up to 75%. A 2019 report by the U.S. International Trade Commission described this as one of the agreement's most consequential changes for U.S. manufacturing. It also introduced a new concept: labor value content. Roughly 40 to 45% of a vehicle's content now had to be produced in plants where workers earn at least $16 an hour, a rule clearly aimed at pushing some value away from low-wage Mexican production and toward US and Canadian facilities. So was this really a win or a hidden tax? In theory, that sounds like a win for American workers. More local content, higher wages, level the playing field. In practice, it meant every automaker operating in North America had to redo the math on every model, every platform, and every sourcing decision. Legal teams and consultants flourished. Compliance departments grew. And quietly, some companies looked at the cost of meeting the new thresholds and decided it was cheaper to just pay the regular World Trade Organization tariff, around 2.5% on passenger vehicles, than to twist their entire supply chain into USMCA's new shape. At the macro level, the USITC estimated USMCA would raise US GDP by about 1/3% in the long run, a modest gain for a lot of political drama. But that average hid something important. Some sectors would pay a much higher price than others. Autos were at the top of that list. Then came the next act. By 2025, the world was no longer dealing just with USMCA's baked-in rules. A new wave of tariffs rolled in. Citing the same national security logic, Washington brought back 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum from neighbors, hitting Canadian and Mexican metal even as USMCA supposedly tied the region closer together. Industry analyses reported benchmark steel going from roughly $800 a ton to around $1,000, aluminum from roughly $2,500 a ton to over $3,000. For an auto plant that uses hundreds of kilos of both, those numbers translate straight into thinner margins. New executive orders layered tariffs onto vehicles and components themselves, including some that were technically USMCA compliant. So what happens when tariffs meant to punish rivals end up punishing Detroit itself? A 2025 note from Federal Reserve economists described average effective U.S. tariffs jumping from a little over 2% in 2024 to more than 13% by mid-2025, with automotive supply chains among the hardest hit. For companies like GM, this wasn't an abstract policy debate. It was a bill. At the same time, USMCA's rules of origin and labor content were fully in force. Compliance wasn't optional anymore. Automakers had two broad choices: spend more to re-engineer their supply chains to hit the 75% local content and $16 wage thresholds, or accept that some models would lose their tariff-free status and become more expensive to move across borders. General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, they were already navigating the electric vehicle transition, investing tens of billions into battery plants, software platforms, and new vehicle architectures. They were already absorbing higher wage costs after major union contracts. Now they were paying more for steel, more for aluminum, and more for compliance, all while trying not to lose ground to Tesla at home and Chinese electric vehicle makers abroad. None of this happened in a vacuum. Canada and Mexico were not passive spectators. Ottawa used negotiations to preserve key cultural and media protections, and extracted limited new access into U.S. dairy and other agricultural markets. Mexico accepted tougher auto rules but demanded, and eventually got, stronger labor provisions, including a rapid response mechanism that allows complaints about specific plants. When Democrats in the U.S. Congress insisted on enforcement for those labor and environmental chapters as the price of ratification, the treaty shifted again. It became not just a Trump deal, but a North American compromise, with tools that could be aimed at all three governments. So was this a clean American win? Or something messier? That's where the liberation lens comes in. On television, USMCA is sold as a story of dominance. The United States bullied its neighbors with tariffs. Canada and Mexico came back to the table. NAFTA was terminated, and a stronger, fairer deal emerged. That's the narrative. The paperwork tells a different story. First, this wasn't a return to the 1950s, with the master dictating terms and the junior partners saluting. It was a three-way knife fight in a legal box. Trump brought the tariffs and the threats. Canada and Mexico brought time, procedure, and coalition politics. In Washington, business lobbies and Congress didn't want a trade war with the country's two largest export markets. In Ottawa and Mexico City, governments couldn't afford to walk away, but they could refuse to sign a pure surrender. The result is what you see in USMCA's structure. Yes, the US got stricter auto rules and some symbolic wins it can point to. But Canada kept cultural exemptions. Mexico gained codified labor mechanisms that activists can now use to challenge cross-border corporate behavior. Investor-state dispute settlement, the old corporate weapon that allowed companies to sue governments directly, was scaled back between the US and Canada and narrowed with Mexico. The digital and IP chapters tilted toward US tech and pharma, but several of the most aggressive pharmaceutical protections were pared down under pressure from US lawmakers themselves. In other words, the United States did not walk away with all the toys. It got a rebranded NAFTA with a thicker rulebook and a series of constraints it also has to obey. Second, the attempt to protect US manufacturing with stricter rules and new tariffs has quietly boomeranged. The higher 75% content rule and labor value requirement were meant to anchor more auto value inside high-wage plants. Combined with 25% steel tariffs and higher aluminum costs, they've also made building cars in North America more expensive. Full stop. That hurts Mexican factories. It also hurts plants in Ohio and Ontario. When a Federal Reserve analysis warns that effective tariff burdens have quintupled for complex manufacturing supply chains, it's not talking about Chinese state-owned firms. It's talking about everyone. In that sense, Detroit is paying for Washington's triumphalism. The USMCA chapter that was supposed to bring factories home has created a maze that Asian and European rivals don't have to navigate in their own regions. The tariffs that were supposed to punish cheaters have become an invisible tax on every bolt and sheet these companies buy. Third, and this is the part nobody says out loud on cable news, Canada and Mexico also learned from Trump's tactics and are now applying their own. When the US threatens to weaponize access to its market, its neighbors respond by weaponizing something else: friction. They stretch implementation timelines. They use joint committees to slow down interpretations they don't like. They lean on labor and environmental provisions when it suits them. They make sure their own state banks, development agencies, and regulators keep hands on the steering wheel of any joint initiative. This is the same pattern we've seen in our episodes on Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Taiwan. The old master-slave framework, issue an ultimatum, demand tribute, expect obedience, is being replaced by a far more complicated game. The US tries to dictate terms. Middle powers and swing sovereigns accept the headlines but rewrite the fine print. They trade symbolic concessions for real control over timing, governance, and domestic dividends. So has USMCA hurt America? At the level of national GDP, the answer is not dramatically. The North American economy is still deeply integrated. Trade volumes are still huge. The system did not collapse. But at the level that actually matters to people in places like Michigan, Ontario, and Nuevo León, the picture is very different. Automakers face higher input costs and stricter rules, just as they're fighting for survival in a new electric, software-driven market. Workers are told this is all in their name, yet still watch plants close or models move. Canada and Mexico were supposed to be beaten back into line. Instead, they sit at the same table, holding more tools of their own. The United States won a narrative. NAFTA was defeated, American strength restored. What it actually won was a more complex treaty that raises the cost of doing business at home, binds its own firms to new obligations, and teaches its partners exactly how to negotiate under pressure next time. And that might be the most important lesson of all. Because as we move toward USMCA's 2026 review, every one of these actors, Washington, Ottawa, Mexico City, and Detroit, will come back with their own ledger of who really gained and who really paid. The question isn't just whether the deal will be softened, tightened, or extended. It's whether America is ready to admit that in trying to dominate its neighbors with tariffs and threats, it also put new shackles on itself. If this helped you see beyond the victory speeches and into the wiring underneath, you know what to do. Subscribe, share, and stay with us. This is Liberation Lens. And in a world of noisy headlines, perspective is the last real edge.